Hello everybody, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, bringing you today part 2 of A System Against the French. In our first lecture, I looked at why I felt knight c3 was White's best attempt against the French to gain an advantage. And today, we're going to look at one of Black's main responses against knight c3, and that is knight of 6, bishop g5, and now bishop e7. One of the reasons I think this system with knight c3 and bishop g5 is so strong is that many Black players will play bishop e7 here, which I think White can gain a nice advantage without too much trouble, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The other options that Black has here are de and bishop b4, the so-called McCutcheon variation. And we'll look at those in separate lectures. Okay, so today we're going to look at bishop e7, which is the most common move you'll face, I think, after bishop g5. Black breaks the pin, but I think what he's basically doing is walking into a big positional problem. So after bishop e7, we're going to play e5, and after knight d7, we're simply going to take the bishop. h4 is also a possible move, but to my mind, I don't think we need to do anything fancy like h4, simply because White is just going to get an advantage after swapping the bishops. And let's talk about that for a second. So I'm a French player, and what I really don't like about this position for Black is that Black has traded off his best piece, his bishop on f8. And the reason that's his best piece is all of our pawns are on light squares. And there's another reason, is that really, in a long-term strategical sense, what Black is going to want to do is to challenge the dark squares that are blockading his pawns on e6 and d5. And so those dark squares are d4, e5, f4, the whole complex of dark squares that are blocking our pawns from advancing, essentially. And it's not only the pawns, it's important to say, that are blocking our pawns from advancing, but it's also White's control of those squares. So by losing our dark square bishop, we're just going to have one less piece to fight for those dark squares. Okay, let's just make another move for White. The best move is f4, cementing control over e5. And, like I said, initiating this long-term plan of playing on the dark square. So I want to talk a little bit about what White's ideas are here. This variation in particular is going to be more about ideas than a specific variation. We'll find that Black can do many different moves, but that the basic ideas for both sides are going to be the same. Now, the first thing I want to point out for White is this. Your mindset here, as the White player, should be one of trying to grind Black down. Don't try to knock him out immediately. And in general, with the French, you're not going to be able to knock your opponent out immediately. However, you should also be very happy here from a strategical point of view. For one, it's going to be very hard for Black to challenge your control of the dark squares. And two, you've gotten this beautiful exchange where you've exchanged off your worst bishop, and we can see that clearly in this position, that the dark squared bishop for White would be very bad given that all of his pawns are in dark squares. And we've obviously gotten rid of the dark square bishop for Black, which is his best piece. Now, the other long-term thing that White has in this position is that we've gotten rid of the best bishop of Black, and that's going to make this bishop on c8 even more worrisome for Black. A little bit hard to explain, but my experience with the French is if we lose our good bishop, the deficiencies of our other bishop will become even more pronounced because we don't have any potential of fighting on the dark squares, and we can only fight on the light squares. And the other key long-term feature for White is that we're going to be playing against this bishop on c8. And our dream really is for us to have a knight versus that bishop. The knight, we'll find, will be able to blockade on the dark squares, whereas the bishop cannot, and it will make the bishop look very silly. And this is a long-term problem of the French, is to have this bad bishop on c8 really mar our positional prospects. And we're going to look at a game now where I think a lot of these strategies came together for white. Like I said, in the French, and in particular this variation, it's going to be about ideas, and it's not going to be about remembering specific moves. And that's why I think an instructional game is probably the best way to go about it. Okay, so in this position, this is Peter Leko against Sergei Volkov, 2000. Black castled. Again, he can do many different moves, but please bear in mind that we're just going to look at some of the main features. Knight f3, c5. Notice also that, like any kind of annoying move like queen b4, really doesn't work. For example, we can even play a3 and just laugh at him because queen takes b2, knight a4 will trap the queen. So, c5 was played. Clearly, black has to fight this way. White takes. Knight c6. Now, in this position, I just want to say there's actually more ways to play than Peter Leko actually played here. Peter Leko is going to play bishop d3 and castle on the king side, which is probably the safest plan. But you could also castle on the queen side, and if you do, by playing moves like queen d2 and castles long, the same ideas are basically going to be there. We're going to blockade on the dark squares, we're going to fight against the bishop on c8. So it doesn't actually matter which plan white chooses. The general ideas are going to be the same. Okay, so here he plays bishop d3. I personally would like to castle on the king side simply because there's no need to risk anything, it seems to me here. White already has the advantage. There's no need for him to do anything out of the ordinary to maintain his advantage. Okay, so Volkov's a very strong player and has probably thought about this position. And here he plays f5. Let's talk about this for a second. The point is he would like, before Leko castles, to try to get some kind of counterplay. Now, if white castles now, black could play knight c5 and have good counterplay by playing knight e4. And that's why Leko here took en passant. Okay, so Volkov takes back with the queen, threatening the f4 pawn. And here, a very nice move is made, just simply g3, protecting the pawn. Now, on one hand, you could say to yourself, well, look, it looks like this king side where we're about to castle is looking kind of drafty. But in fact, not only does g3 just defend the pawn on f4, but it really is securing the dark squares. And that's what this game is really about. So, knight d5, castle, bishop d7. Now, one thing about this is that I realize some players might be afraid of this exchange here, knight takes bishop. But in fact, that's probably a mistake by black. And the reason for that is that our bishop, our light squared bishop, doesn't actually fight for the dark squares, e5 and d4. So if we exchange it for the knight on c5, which can fight for those squares, that's not such a bad thing for us. In fact, that's pretty good. So usually when we try to, with a lot of variations, we try to save the bishop. And here, we're not really afraid of it at all if he trades. And this game is going to be a good example of that. Okay, bishop d7, queen d2. And here Volkov plays rook a8, which maybe you could criticize, but really, I think a lot of the ideas we're going to see in this game are going to be similar in any case. So let's just see what happens in the game. Rook AE1. Simple chess. That's what I like about this game and this variation for white in general. We're just going to put all of our pieces focusing on the central squares, and in particular this square here, E5. We're just going to blockade it. We're going to sit on it. Bishop E8 is played. And here it's a very instructive move that's made. Mortals like myself would play in this position almost certainly just knight E5, after which white's going to have an advantage. If knight takes, we'll just play rook takes. And we have a good grip on the central dark squares, and the pawn on E6 is simply weak. Okay, but let's look at what Liko did, and even if we don't do this particular move in our own games, it's probably good to think about why he did it. He played A3, and it's kind of a funny move because it's not immediately obvious what it does. The first thing I think is to realize is that he's realizing that Volkov's going to play bishop H5 anyway, and on bishop H5, then we can sink the knight onto E5. So, in the first sense, it's just A3 isn't a bad move because at the moment black can't do anything incredibly constructive. But why play A3? The reason is A3 is kind of demonstrating to black that we, as white, are working on the dark square. So A3 puts a pawn on the dark squares and controls B4. And what white's kind of saying with this move is that his global plan is to control all of the dark squares. So notice we've got F4 firmly secured by G3, E5, D4, and now A3 controlling B4, and someday we might even consider playing B4 ourselves, controlling C5. All of those forming this huge grip across the board on the dark squares, blockading those white pawns of black. It's a very interesting strategy, and I think it's one that even us mortals can play because it's very simple. And that's why I'm recommending this system against the French. Okay, so A3, very deep move, but knight E5 from us mortals would also give an advantage. But let's look at what happens. Bishop H5 was played. Knight E5. Knight takes, rook takes. Okay, so now we've got this rook entrenched on E5. And it's clearly a fantastic blockading piece at the moment. It's important laterally against the weakness. And not only that, but I think the fact that we're trading off is actually a good thing for white. In particular, what we're going to be looking to do is trade off this knight on C5. If we can get rid of that knight, we're really going to be close to achieving what we were looking for from the very beginning of this variation, namely getting a position where we have this knight on C3 versus the bishop on H5. And we'll see in this game that it's going to be very uncomfortable for black if white achieves that. And in fact, already here, it's going to be hard for black to stop that. So rook takes E5, bishop G4. And now I think Liko makes a very deep move. He plays queen G2. The point of this move is that we're going to be threatening to play H3. And on H3, the bishop will have to come to F5. Now, the bishop can't come to F5 right now because our bishop on F3, on D3 would just simply take it, and black's structure would be completely ruined. The pawn on D5 would fall. So, what's going to have to happen is if black wants to play the bishop to F5 now, after we push to H3, he's going to have to trade the knight on C5 for our bishop on D3. And at first glance, I think a lot of players would say to themselves, well, I don't want to give up my bishop. But that's really precisely what Liko wants. He wants to force black to trade off his best piece and to get this knight versus bishop middle game. Okay, so let's look at how this went. plays the rook to c8, anticipating that he's going to have to trade the knight for the bishop. h3, knight takes bishop, has to. Pawn takes, bishop f5. Very interesting. I think here a lot of people would see the bishop on f5 and think to themselves, well, the bishop's outside the pawn chain, isn't it a good bishop? But in fact, it's not so clear, because the bishop is still blocked by his own pawns, and we're threatening to make moves against it, like g4, shoving it back. So the first thing Liko does is just protects the pawn on d3, rook to f3. And we're looking to play things now like g4 and g5 and queen e2 to attack the e-pawn. And really, for example, White's threatening to do something like g4, bishop g6, and queen e2, forcing the bishop to go back to f7 at some point. And that's just a miserable position for the bishop. And after that, White will then seriously consider transferring his knight to d4. Maybe via b5, knight b5, knight to d4. And we'd have a completely crushing positional assault in that position. So I think Volkov got a sense of the danger here and basically went in for a desperate maneuver because he sensed this coming strategical domination by White. So what Volkov tried was d4. So the pawn on d4 is going to be very weak, but he's hoping that he can penetrate with his rooks and at least create some kind of difficulty. But we'll find that this knight is still the hero of this game. This knight's going to be much stronger than the bishop. So, knight b5 was played. Rook c1, king h2. Rook d8 to defend the pawn. Queen d2, forcing the rook to make a decision. Rook a1. And now simply g4. And the point is, if the bishop goes back, we get a situation similar to what we were talking about before. For example, queen e2, and the bishop's forced to go to a ridiculous place. And if nothing else here, simply f5. Break everything open. And it looks really bad for black. Because if ef, then simply rook takes, and we'll take on f7 next move. So I think Volkov again made a practical decision here and decided that that position was lost. So he again made a kind of desperate maneuver. He played bishop takes, pawn takes, and then hoped to get some kind of pressure against the white king. It's kind of funny, though, that even in this position, it turns out it's going to be the knight that's the hero. Queen takes f4, queen g5, queen f8, rook e6. And watch now how white coordinates his knight and his rook against the black king, even though it looks like white's king is the one that's so open. Rook c8, knight d6. Very beautiful move. The knight is turned now into an octopus. An octopus being a knight that we plant on like d6 and e6 and can protect the thing. And the reason it's called an octopus is it attacks 8 critical squares all around the board. And it's very hard for black to deal with all of that influence from such a penetrated knight into his camp. Okay. Notice, too, that the rook can't come down to c1 because the queen takes c1. So black threatens the queen, but now we do another move. Queen d5, and now rook c1 would just be met by rook e1. And now the position's simply lost because the king has to move, and white takes the rook. A couple more moves were played, but it's clear white's completely winning. He's up a rook. I'd just like to summarize what I see in this game and I've seen in many other high-level games with this variation. So the general plan is this. White blockades on the dark squares, and the effect of that, let's go back actually. The effect of the blockade on the dark squares is really a positional idea in many ways against the bad bishop on c8. You see, because if these pawns on e6 and d5 can't move, e6 and d5 can't move, then the bishop on c8 can't be effective in the game. Also, what White's saying is that because we've traded off the dark squared bishop on e7, it's going to be harder for him to attack the dark squares that we're trying to create a hold upon. So the plan is very simple. Grab the dark squares and play against the bishop on c8. And, like in this game, try to attain some kind of position with a knight versus the bishop. If you just play simple chess, like in this game, you'll find that it's actually very hard for black to do anything about it. Watch these moves. It wasn't anything fantastic. E takes, queen takes, g3, knight takes, castle, d7, queen d2, rook a d8, bishop e8, and already White has a tangible advantage. So, that's why I don't like this variation when I play the French. After bishop g5, I don't like to play bishop e7. It just seems like White gets a clear advantage. And at the same time in tournament play, when I watch other French players, they play this move bishop e7 all the time, and that's one of the reasons I think this is a very good system against the French. So, this is International Master Jesse Kraai, hoping you've enjoyed part 2 of a system against the French.